Hello, hello. All right. Well, thanks so much, everyone, for making the time to be here. I know that it's in the afternoon. As I mentioned, I'll probably do the talk in English, and then I'll take some questions in Spanish. So definitely, I have 15 minutes. So if you have a burning question, just go ahead and raise your hand, and let's make this a discussion. We only have a little bit of time. So first of all, my name is Carlos Rodarte. I'm the founder and managing director of Volar Health, a strategic consultancy that focuses on helping pharma companies, startups, and health systems think more about digital transformation. So how do you incorporate new forms of data and new forms to analyze that data to better capture patient outcomes in the real world? So I'm going to spend 15 minutes and I want to convey 5 things. So I'm going to try to be very fast. The first is our definition of self is evolving. And if you think back 10, 15, 20 years ago, you'd go to the doctor, maybe that doctor has seen 10 patients like you, doesn't have a lot of background, maybe read the latest scientific publication, but doesn't really know how to treat you. And what I find really interesting right now, what I do a lot of work in, is this world of your digital self. And how do you sort of release new information, digital biomarkers about your digital phenotype, the way that you use technology can be very indicative of how you're sleeping or how healthy you are. And all of this information can now be captured in a systematic way. But that's not it. What I find most interesting is almost philosophically, the sense of self and who we are. It's beyond our physical selves, it's beyond our digital selves, but it's looking more at our computable past and future self. And I think this is where it really gets interesting, where right now you can capture as much information about yourself, how you use technology, and doctors can then finally say, hey, we have a very good understanding of your past, and we have a very good sense of how your future is going to look. How do we take the best action today? And that is a fundamentally different way of thinking about providing care. And that is a fundamentally different way about doing research, which is really, really interesting to me personally. Now, the second, this is where I've gotten into a lot of fights with doctors. I'll go into, my mom, for example, she hates taking medicines, and my mom is a non-compliant patient. Doctors say she's a bad patient, she never takes her medications, we don't know what's wrong with her. And then I talk to my mom, and I'm like, Mom, why aren't you taking your medication? And she's all like, well, I live alone, I'm in California, you're in Boston, I'm afraid of the side effects. If I take the medication, what if something happens to me and I'm alone? So she takes 1/10 of the dose, and of course she doesn't get better. But she will never tell her doctor that because the doctor's going to judge her. And I think that's one small example of how we're slowly thinking about how our everyday lives are actually much more important in our fears and our aspirations than the way that we try to get better with our doctor's recommendations. I won't spend a lot of time on this slide, but needless to say, there's a ton of data that encompasses how our health is today. And this involves, non-traditional data, social determinants of health. It involves, your built environment, the way the light exposure. We know that light itself can impact your 24-hour circadian rhythms, and that in itself can cause metabolic disease 10, 15 years later. So we know that our environment, this light here, is actually impacting our health, but we're not capturing it. And I think because we have so much data, we have to really be smart about what questions are we asking. With so much information, we can't assume that just because we have all of this data, we're going to get an answer. Sometimes you just have to ask your mom why she's not taking her medication. And there's no amount of data that's going to answer that for you passively. Sometimes you just need that human connection to get at the real essence of things. Okay, number 3, we're making good time. A range of use cases are emerging. And right now, I think it's silly to talk about the use cases in artificial intelligence because in 5, 10 years, maybe in a year, AI is going to be everywhere. Everything's going to be AI driven. But right now in the medical field, we're still thinking, wow, well, which areas are most adept to, predicting readmission rates, or how can we understand, disease progression a little bit better? In 5, 10 years time, that's just going to be normal. It's going to be part of the way that we do research and part of the way that we do care. But just to give you some examples of how I personally think about it, it's not about the use cases by themselves, but it's understanding the patient experience and how they're actually going to get diagnosed, how they're actually going to get their first medication, how they're going to relapse, how they're going to understand that entire journey. Because the patient that is here, mentally and emotionally and physically, is different than the patient that is here, and it's different than the patient that is here. When you get diagnosed with something, it changes your identity. And we don't talk about that. You have to have new behaviors, you have to do things differently, and no one helps us to do that. So as we think about use cases with AI, yes, they can be methodologically very robust, but for the patient, it fundamentally just means a better experience. You were able to anticipate the need, and that's it. Now the method that a doctor uses, the method that a machine uses, that's over here. But fundamentally, it's how do you impact, the user experience. Okay, number 4. So we're almost getting there. With so much information, who owns the information? Who makes money off of it? How do we standardize it? How do we normalize it? These are all very, very important questions. And I think one area that we're still not talking a lot about is for the people that are actually analyzing the data, they're humans. They have their own biases. They have their own backgrounds. They have their own cultural beliefs. That impacts the way that you do analysis. And should data scientists have their own code of ethics? Just like a doctor? Do no harm? I think so, but I think we're still very early in thinking exactly how that would operate and what are the best practices that we can leverage to do that. On the patient side, so much of the information, particularly in clinical trials, belongs to the pharma companies. It doesn't necessarily belong to the patient, but they're making money off of it. Should patients get paid every time their data is used? How do we think about that? Would patients be okay with, a genetic test that you pay for, you give it to a company, then that company goes off and creates drugs, and then they make millions off of the data that you paid to get? Does that feel right? Maybe, maybe not. It maybe depends on the patient. But I think we should be having these conversations in a much more transparent way. Okay, this is the last point. Point number 5. AI is just going to augment human intelligence. It's not going to replace it. I think there was a speaker before that said, potentially, diagnoses will happen 100% through AI. I do think you will have that in some cases, but it's fundamentally focused on 2 axes. The ability to automate something, and you don't see it down here, but it's the ability to describe something in words. So if you're actually able to explain how something is happening, if you're able to describe what the patient was going through, what was happening biologically, what was happening with people's behaviors, what was happening as a result of the environment, then you can begin to think about ways to automate it. And right now, we're nowhere near that yet. So I'll leave you with this last quote, and I'll read it out loud. What will AI allow us to automate? We'll be able to automate everything that we can describe. The problem is, it's not clear what we can describe. So if you take anything away from this talk, it's that you need to be thinking about the human experience and the ability to tell a narrative, to share a story, and then make that computational, versus expecting that the data, just by virtue of having it and applying the latest methods, is going to magically give you an answer. So anyways, thank you so much.
¿Hay alguna pregunta? ¿No?
Bueno, pregunto en castellano, ¿vale? Todo ese panorama que habías mostrado antes sobre cómo hacer las preguntas correctas, ¿cómo lo hacéis? ¿Cómo lo tratáis vosotros desde Volar? Si es que hacéis eso, si es que trabajáis en cómo encontrar la pregunta correcta. ¿Cuál es vuestro approach?
Sí, bueno, hay una combinación, pero yo a mí siempre en mis clientes y en la manera que yo lo he hecho con mis compañías en el pasado, es que comienzo con el paciente. Le pregunto cómo se siente y de ahí comenzamos todo. Y después le preguntamos, bueno, cómo uno vive en casa, cómo uno vive en su ciudad. Y le preguntamos más y le preguntamos más. Y después, a un punto, decidimos, bueno, ¿hay una manera más fácil para atraer esta información? Y si la respuesta es sí, entonces pensamos, bueno, cuáles wearables traemos, cuáles otras, ¿me entiendes? Pero hay un riesgo en que nada más comenzamos con el paciente y no aprendemos suficiente. Es un balance y lo que uno puede decir como passive monitoring para aprender más sobre las condiciones, ¿no? A veces uno tiene que así hacer measurement y después aprende un poquito más, pero le tiene que preguntar al paciente en maneras frecuentes cuando eso está pasando.
Sí, mi pregunta es, cuando hacéis la recogida de los datos, o sea, ¿estáis como muy como tailor-made sobre el paciente? ¿Qué pasa si, por ejemplo, queréis estudiar un patrón determinado? Porque claro, me parece que estáis como más enfocados como hacia ser muy personalizados. ¿Podéis como ir como de abajo a arriba o podéis ir no sé si me explico.
Sí, sí te explicas bien. Creo que te entendí. En este slide es para una persona individual, ¿no? Pero en verdad, puede ser miles de personas arriba. Y uno se aprende así para toda la gente, no nada más para el paciente único. Y eso es lo bonito de ir hacia arriba, es que no nada más es la experiencia de uno mismo, pero es la experiencia de uno con los demás que puede ayudar. Creo que te entendí. Sí.
¿Hay alguna pregunta más? Pues gracias.
Gracias.